Just involved, understanding when the mission would be complete, what will be left when it is, what will be left behind us when that mission has been terminated. These elements, I believe, are essential to our foreign policy, and I haven't seen them from the President. As I've watched.
Mitt Romney from this morning in Jacksonville. Just to let you know, all of the statements from this morning, Mitt Romney, Secretary Clinton, and President Obama, available now in our video library at cspan.org. We're looking live at the Capitol. The flags have been lowered to half-staff. Speaker Boehner ordering that mid-morning today after the killings of the 4 State Department personnel at the U.S. consulate in Benghazi, Libya. The House will be coming in momentarily, gaveling in for a number of legislative items, and also this afternoon a moment of silence for those killed in Libya. Live now to the House floor here on C-SPAN.
The House will be in order. The prayer will be offered by the guest chaplain, the Reverend Matthew Mello, from the Church of the Resurrection, Lakeland, Florida.
Dear God, we give you thanks for giving us another day. We ask for your blessings to this legislative body as they govern the welfare of all the people of this great nation. Endow them with wisdom, discernment, and courage, and conviction to engage the issues of our day and for the generations to come, to be better off as a result of all their decisions made within this Assembly Hall. Bind them together in a shared commitment to you, a passionate patriotism, and a deep dedication to find creative solutions in the concerns that confront us and divide us in these times. We remember our Ambassador, Christopher Stevens, and his colleagues. We ask that this be done this day, in the days to come, giving honor and glory to you, our God, and we pray your blessings be upon us always. In your name we pray. Amen.
The Chair has examined the Journal of the last day's proceedings and announces the House's approval thereof. Pursuant to Clause 1 of Rule 1, the Journal stands approved. The Pledge of Allegiance will be led by the gentleman from Minnesota, Mr. Ellison.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Without objection, the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Ross, is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I wanted to take a brief moment to say thank you to today's chaplain. I would also like to thank the Speaker for making this possible. The invocation today was offered by Father Matthew Mello of Resurrection Catholic Church in my hometown of Lakeland, Florida. Mr. Speaker, in 1963, my mother and father helped found the church Father Mello calls home. And like my parents and most Floridians, Father Mello is, well, he's a geographic mutt. Born in New Jersey, attended grade school in Puerto Rico, went to high school in Florida, attended seminary in Indiana, and studied theology in Chicago. We don't know if he's a Yankees fan, a Cubs fan, or a White Sox fan. But one thing for certain, since 1998, Father Mello has been a constant and reassuring presence in the spiritual life of countless residents of my hometown and to my family. His presence in my dad's final year of life was a comfort to him as well as to my family. Father Mello personifies Christ's instruction to us to be the servant of all. I firmly believe, as the Bible also says, that the fervent prayer of a righteous man availeth much. Knowing Father Mello, I have no doubt that today's prayer was heard on high. I thank him for his prayer today, his lifetime of service, and I yield back.
Chair will entertain 15 further requests for 1-minute speeches on each side of the aisle. For what purpose is the gentleman from Pennsylvania rise?
Address the House for 1 minute. Rise and stand.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, Pastor Yusuf Nadarkhani has been released from prison in Iran. After 3 years of suffering in prison, with the death penalty hanging over his head on false charges, Pastor Yusuf is now home with his family. This weekend, he was suddenly brought before a court, convicted on a more minor sentence, and granted time served. While we applaud his release, we cannot forget how Pastor Yusuf was abused and falsely accused over the past 3 years. He was subject to intense interrogation. His wife was arrested, taken away from their 2 young sons for a period of time. His lawyer was arrested on trumped-up charges. Earlier this year, the House drew attention to this persecution when it overwhelmingly passed a resolution calling for the immediate release of Pastor Yusuf. We made it clear that the world was watching and would not tolerate the execution of an innocent man. The government of Iran continues to abuse religious minorities within its borders, Jews, Sunni Muslims, Baha'is, as well as Christians. Pastor Yusuf's release is a victory for human rights, but we cannot forget about the other victims of this corrupt regime. I yield back.
For the purpose of the gentleman from Oregon, seek recognition. Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Wind power is an American success story. It is one of our fastest-growing manufacturing sectors with over 500 American-based facilities. It provides us with clean, renewable energy that both consumers and the environment demand. But unfortunately, it is threatened with the production tax credit due to expire at the end of the year. I'm pleased to join with my fellow Ways and Means Committee member Dave Reichert from the Northwest as co-sponsor of H.R. 3307 to extend the tax credit so that we don't lose as many as 37,000 jobs to the uncertainty. Congress shouldn't wait until the end of the year because people need to make investment decisions now. Until we enact a comprehensive energy plan for this century, the production tax credit is key to our energy future. Clean, dependable, very low operating cost wind energy. Please join us as we work to guarantee this production tax credit for our economy and our energy security.
For what purposes, gentleman from Alabama, seek recognition. Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, in Egypt, our embassy walls were scaled and the American flag ripped apart. In Libya, Americans ambassadors and 3 other Americans were brutally murdered. Ironically, our own embassy in Egypt apologized by condemning Americans who exercise their religious and free speech rights as, quote, misguided individuals who hurt the religious feelings of Muslims, end quote. The White House, rivaling the Keystone Cops of lore, distanced itself from its own State Department apology. Let's be clear. In Libya, this White House spent American treasury and risked American lives to topple Muammar Gaddafi, thus empowering those who killed our ambassador. Not one to learn from history or its own mistakes, this White House says America, quote, will work to support a Syrian opposition to hasten the day when Assad falls, end quote. Mr. Speaker, we must stop spending our treasury and risking American lives for those who neither appreciate our sacrifices nor believe in basic liberties like freedom of religion and freedom of speech. Mr. Speaker, I pray the President is listening.
For what purpose, the gentleman from Colorado, seek recognition.
For permission to address the House for 1 minute.
Without objection.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Mr. Speaker. I too rise to promote the extension of the production tax credit. Thousands of jobs in Colorado and across the nation are dependent upon this incentive for good, clean energy here in the United States. Thousands of manufacturing jobs made right here, the wind production right here in America. Colorado, we have substantial manufacturing plants with Vestas. We have vendors who supply these particular manufacturers for this good, clean energy. Yet we have the production tax credit that's about to expire. Bipartisan support is in Colorado, where we have virtually every member, Democrats and Republicans, as well as you heard Mr. Blumenauer say he has a Republican co-sponsor for this. But the Republican leadership will not bring it up, and it's been removed from the platform of the Republican Party. These are good jobs in America. It's clean energy for our country. It's good for national security. If we make these things, these big windmills in America, we will make it in America. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
For what purpose, the gentleman from Illinois, seek recognition.
Yes, consent to address the House for 1 minute.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, this is a tragic day for the United States and for all people across the world who stand for freedom, freedom of speech and religious tolerance. But it is also a day that serves as a powerful reminder of why we hold these core principles, why each generation of Americans over the past 2 centuries has proudly fought to preserve and advance them, and why we must confidently answer the call to do the same today. My thoughts and prayers are with Ambassador Stevens' family and with the families of the 3 American diplomats murdered in the attack in Libya. There is simply no excuse or rationale to be found here. There's absolutely no justification for violence and murder against Americans. This act of terror stands in direct opposition to the freedom and liberty that we champion throughout the world. This is an extraordinarily volatile time in the Middle East, and as Americans we should expect, we should demand nothing less than strong leadership from the United States. As is shown by the murder of American officials in Libya today, the storming of the U.S. Embassy in Egypt yesterday, and most certainly by Iran's fragrant march toward nuclear weapons, this is no game. I am sickened and outraged by these recent events. It's time to lead.
What purpose does the gentleman from New York seek recognition? Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, tonight I will join members of Congress Mike Quigley and Pat Meehan in an ice hockey game with and to benefit the Wounded Warriors. The Wounded Warriors is a great organization that takes care of our returning injured soldiers. Congress, however, is not living up to its responsibility to do the same. The unemployment rate for returning veterans under the age of 24 is 29%. Congress just approved $53 billion for road and bridge repair next year, a very weak response to a big and important issue, particularly when you consider that we just spent $90 billion rebuilding the roads and bridges of Afghanistan. If you really want to say thank you to the veterans on behalf of a grateful nation, let's nation build at home and put our veterans to work rebuilding the America they so honorably defended. I yield back.
What purpose does the gentleman from South Carolina seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute advising extend my remarks.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, the brave men and women serving in our armed forces dedicate their lives protecting this great nation, both at home and abroad. Access to absentee voter registration within our military's ranks has been increasingly difficult due to changing residencies and overseas deployments. In order to make voting for our service members more accessible, Congress passed the Military and Overseas Voter Empowerment Act. Unfortunately, the administration has failed in its implementation. On Thursday, the House Armed Services Subcommittee on Military Personnel will hold a hearing to investigate these issues, an effort to determine why the Department of Defense has failed to properly implement the legislation. As chairman of this subcommittee, I look forward to hearing witnesses explain and ensure that those serving in our armed forces are given the best available access to voter registration. Every reasonable effort should be made to enable service members have the ability to vote. In conclusion, God bless our troops, and we will never forget September 11th and the global war on terrorism. Our sympathy to the families of Ambassador Christopher Stevens and our foreign service officers in Libya and Egypt.
What purpose does the gentleman from Minnesota seek recognition? Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, I am deeply disturbed by the attacks on our diplomatic missions in Libya and Egypt. 4 Americans have been now killed, including U.S. Ambassador to Libya, Chris Stevens. These Americans served bravely and with distinction, and this is a terrible, terrible tragedy. I have seen this amateurish and stupid video, and there's nothing in it, despite the fact that it is deliberately provocative, that could ever justify the murder of these innocent people. The fact is, this must be condemned in the strongest terms. These individuals who didn't like this video, and there's much to dislike about it, could have peacefully protested, could have written letters, and could have registered their disapproval in a number of ways, but they resorted to murder. And this is morally objectionable, and the whole world must condemn it. Of course, it doesn't help to provoke people, even if you have the right to do so, but it is always wrong to respond with violence and mayhem. I yield back.
What purpose does the gentleman from Texas seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute to revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, Texans have shared with me their stories about the businesses that they have built without the help of the federal government. Kelly from Crosby, Texas wrote me this: Congressman, you are correct that small business owners carry the full load of government taxes. On average, our small $3 million a year business pays 35% in federal taxes, pays Social Security at 7.45%, federal unemployment tax, state franchise tax, school district and real estate property taxes,
and I am taxed on the computer used to send this email to you. And the President says, I didn't build it? I beg to differ. During the first 3 years, my work week was 80 hours a week. If the federal government debt of $16 trillion is not brought under control, it will not matter how hard I work because the dollar's value will be worthless. Federal government, fix your spending problem, put your house in order because small business is watching and thinking, if I ran my business like you run yours, the bank would foreclose. Mr. Speaker, Kelly is correct. Big government hasn't built America. American small business owners have built it on their own. And that's just the way it is.
For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Massachusetts seek recognition?
Request permission to address the House for 1 minute.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today as a member of the Sustainable Energy and Environment Coalition to talk about a critical issue for Massachusetts and our nation, the wind production tax credit. Providing a modest credit of 2.2 cents per kilowatt-hour generated, it has encouraged over $75 billion in private investment over the last 5 years. Now, 60% of the average turbine is manufactured here in the United States. These companies hire a diversity of workers and provide good-paying jobs in a rapidly growing sector of our economy. Bay Stater Nigel Green worked for GE Wind as a wind farm parts runner. He says, quote, I can tell you honestly that nothing gave me more pride in my country than seeing a turbine go from in repair status back to online and producing clean, renewable power. It is truly a sight to behold, unquote. Last year alone, clean energy jobs in Massachusetts grew 11%. If it is allowed to expire, we will lose an important new manufacturing opportunity and too many good-paying American jobs. Thank you, and I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentlewoman from New York seek recognition? Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, during our recess this past month, we held a small business roundtable in our Hudson Valley, and we sat, actually everybody was transfixed, all the participants, for an hour and a half talking about what our small businesses need to do, and one of what we need to do to help our small businesses, and one of the key considerations was to ease the climate for creating jobs and growing our businesses. I am so proud to have supported the Jobs Act with our Democratic and Republican colleagues and with the Senate. It was signed into law, as we all know, by the President in March. Tomorrow in Financial Services Committee, we begin to review implementation of the Jobs Act. And I hope that we can continue to work together to make true progress in growing our small businesses, in helping them by making sure that the path is clear for them to grow and thrive and prosper. And this is a great example of how both parties can work together to achieve that goal. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition? Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, last month our nation reached a significant milestone in the growth of homegrown renewable energy. The United States surpassed 50 gigawatts of installed wind power capacity, and that's enough to power over 13 million American households a year. This is a major accomplishment for an industry predicted to deliver only a quarter of that amount a decade ago. We should be celebrating this success brought about by innovation, hard work, and smart policies. But sadly, the celebration may be a short one if Congress doesn't act swiftly to continue the bipartisan production tax credit, which is a key factor in wind power's expansion. My constituents who work at companies like Clipper Wind and Infinity Wind Power have told me that letting the PTC lapse would devastate their industry and eliminate thousands of jobs. It's time to give these companies certainty by taking up a multi-year extension of the PTC without delay. Our country cannot afford to pull the rug out from under a true American success story. Let's renew the production tax credit now and maintain our leadership in transitioning to cleaner, safer sources of energy. I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Kansas seek recognition?
Speaker, I seek unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute and revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, just one day after the 11th anniversary of the September 11th terrorist attacks on the United States of America, sadly, the American flag flies at half-staff today at the U.S. Capitol once again, following the senseless and tragic attack against our U.S. consulate in Libya, which left 4 patriotic embassy workers laying dead. Among those murdered include American Ambassador Christopher Stevens, marking one of the rare moments in U.S. history where a U.S. ambassador is killed representing our nation abroad. This type of cowardly and brutal attack is an outrage, and those responsible should be swiftly brought to justice. The service of Ambassador Stevens and 3 other embassy staff will not be forgotten, as their service represents everything that our country stands for in promoting peace and democracy and liberty for all peoples across the globe. Mr. Speaker, God bless the brave men and women who serve our country everywhere, and God bless the United States of America. I yield back.
For what purpose, the gentleman from Delaware seek recognition?
Seek permission to address the House for 1 minute.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to recognize Delaware Speaker of the House, Bob Gilligan. In November, Speaker Gilligan will conclude a 40-year career as a member of Delaware's House of Representatives, making him the longest-serving member in state history. Throughout his career, Speaker Gilligan has been one of the most effective leaders in Delaware state government. Speaker Gilligan has been a trusted and compassionate leader during times when Delaware needed him most. He helped lead the state through some of its most difficult fiscal challenges. He championed open government legislation that gave Delawareans unprecedented access to their representatives and oversaw the passage of landmark civil rights reforms. And he did this while maintaining the friendship and respect of his colleagues on both sides of the aisle. On a personal level, I will always appreciate Speaker Gilligan's friendship and support. He gave me my first job in public service as a legislative fellow, an experience that inspired my work in government and politics. It has been a real privilege for me to work over the years with Bob, and I'd like to congratulate Speaker Bob Gilligan on an outstanding career and wish him well in his retirement. Thank you. I yield back.
What purpose, the gentleman from Pennsylvania seek recognition? Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to commend and congratulate Dr. James J. Links on the occasion of his retirement from his post as president of the Bucks County Community College in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. As its president for the last 20 years, Dr. Links has led the community college through some of its most ambitious expansions, including new investments in technology, the addition of distance learning courses, and impressive updates to campus building and infrastructure. William Arthur Wood once said that the mediocre teacher tells, the good teacher explains, the superior teacher demonstrates, the great teacher inspires. During his time at the Bucks County Community College, Dr. Links has inspired countless students through his leadership and dedication to providing men and women of all ages from Bucks County with a quality education. On behalf of the people of Pennsylvania's 8th Congressional District, I thank Dr. Links for his service to the community, and I wish him the best of luck in all of his future endeavors. And I yield back.
What purpose, the gentleman from Massachusetts seek recognition?
Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute.
Without objection.
Speaker, I rise to reiterate my support for the wind production tax credit and the investment tax credit for offshore wind. The production tax credit has encouraged nearly $20 billion in nationwide private investment annually over the last 5 years, while the ITC serves as the most fundamental federal tax incentive for offshore wind development. As we promote investments that will reduce our dependence on foreign oil and serve as a central part in our fight against climate change, it's essential to remember the spillover of job creation and specialized expertise that will follow. In Massachusetts, we've witnessed firsthand the critical economic development opportunities of renewable energy projects provided to our states. Our region has undergone an economic regeneration with the development of Cape Wind, the nation's first offshore wind farm. From the Port of New Bedford, which will serve as a staging area for turbine assembly, to the ferry captains who provide eco tours of turbines, few communities will not be benefited by this. Massachusetts is already recognized as one of the top 3 states for clean energy. We are home to nearly 5,000 individual clean energy companies, and nearly 2% of all Massachusetts jobs are now in this field. It's important as we go forward that we not let this void occur and we fill it with jobs made in America. Thank you.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Colorado seek recognition?
Permission to address the House for 1 minute, revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today as a member of the House Sustainable Energy and Environmental Coalition to call on Congress to renew the wind production tax credit. The wind production tax credit provides a small tax incentive to wind companies to produce clean domestic energy. This tax incentive promotes investment, creates jobs, and encourages deployment of wind energy. At the end of this year, the wind production tax credit expires unless Congress acts. This tax credit is essential to level the playing field for wind energy. For instance, the oil and gas industry gets around $40 billion in subsidies over 10 years. If we can eliminate oil and gas subsidies, let's do it. If not, we need to renew the wind production tax credit. The tax credit supports 5,000 jobs in Colorado and 75,000 jobs nationally. We cannot afford to lose these jobs. Both Democrats and Republicans, senators and House members agree we need to extend this common sense tax credit. I urge my colleagues to work together to extend the wind production tax credit to protect and grow America's thriving wind industry. Yield back the balance of my time.
What purpose does the gentleman from Iowa seek recognition? Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, I join my colleagues in the Senate to highlight an important issue to Iowa, the wind production tax credit. It expires this year, as has been mentioned. It must be extended immediately. Inaction has already led to job losses in Iowa and threatens thousands more jobs in our state. The PTC actually has its roots in Iowa and bipartisanship. Senator Grassley worked for its creation, and it has long had bipartisan support. Last month, the Senate passed a bipartisan package that included the wind credit. It's past time for the House to act. Iowa is the second largest producer of wind energy, and turbine manufacturing involves about 200 companies and 6,000 good-paying jobs for Iowans. As we struggle to recover from the worst recession since the Great Depression, Congress cannot play games with people's jobs and pull the rug out from an industry employing thousands. Congress must extend the wind credit now before more jobs are lost, and I yield back.
What purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
Speak to the House for 1 minute, revise and extend.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, today is a day of reflection and sadness and also determination and resolve. The tragic killing of our ambassador in Libya and his staff should remind us all of the dangers that exist around the world, and so we offer our prayers to the families and to the survivors. We also need to think about the future in America and about the necessity for developing alternative energy systems. The production tax credit for wind is absolutely essential. I represent two major wind farms, one in Solano and the other in Alameda County. Thousands of jobs across this nation will be lost unless we extend the wind tax credit. Keep in mind that for a century we have subsidized the oil and gas industry. It's time for us to provide the support necessary to create this industry. We also ought to be making it in America. One of my bills, H.R. 6217, would require that 85% of the content of these turbines and solar systems be made in America. With that, I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Indiana seek recognition? Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, we had an attack in Cairo on our embassy yesterday, and we had an attack in Benghazi, yes, in Benghazi, and we lost the ambassador there. He was killed along with 3 other people. I've been on the Foreign Affairs Committee now for about 30 years, and I've never seen anything like what we've seen over the northern tier of Africa. All the way across the northern tier, we've seen the spring that they're talking about, and how things are changing and how democracy is coming. The fact of the matter is, Iran is taking advantage of what's going on over there by sending intermediaries into all those countries to undermine them. I was just in the Persian Gulf recently, and there's absolutely no question that Iran is doing everything they can to undermine all those governments over there. And when you look at what happened in Egypt, with the Muslim Brotherhood taking over, we in this country ought to be very much aware that this is not the end of it. It's not going to go away. And so the administration or the new president, whoever it is that takes office in January, they're going to have a very strong foreign policy because we still get about 35% of our energy from that region. This is not going to end right now. It's going to go on, and we have to be prepared. I yield back the balance of my time.
For the purpose, the gentleman from Washington rise.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous material on H.R. 5544.
Without objection.
Pursuant to House Resolution 773 and Rule 18, the Chair declares the House in the Committee of the Whole House on the State of the Union for the consideration of H.R. 5544. The Chair appoints the gentleman from Idaho, Mr. Simpson, to preside over the Committee of the Whole.
The House is in the Committee of the Whole House on the State of the Union for the consideration of H.R. 5544, which the clerk will report by title.
A bill to authorize and expedite a land exchange involving National Forest System land in the Laurentian District of the Superior National Forest and certain other National Forest System land in the state of Minnesota that has limited recreational and conservation resources and lands owned by the state of Minnesota in trust for the public school system that are largely scattered in checkerboard fashion within the Boundary Waters Canoe Area wilderness and have important recreational, scenic, and conservation resources and for other purposes.
Pursuant to the rule, the bill is considered read for the first time. The gentleman from Washington, Mr. Hastings, and the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Grijalva, each will control 30 minutes. The Chair recognizes the gentleman from Washington.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I support H.R. 5544, the Minnesota Education Investment and Employment Act. This bill will rectify a decades-old injustice that was imposed by Congress during the Carter administration to ensure that funding for schools and education in Minnesota is carried on. When Minnesota became a state, it received certain parcels of lands from the federal government set aside to help fund education. These lands, known as school trust lands, were specifically established to provide funding for Minnesota public schools. Responsible timber management, mineral development, and other economic uses of these lands would generate the revenue that would benefit every child in the state. However, in 1978, Congress designated the Boundary Waters Canoe Area wilderness, and a portion of these trust lands became trapped inside the wilderness area and inaccessible, therefore, for economic development. This caused a decline in funding then for local schools. H.R. 5544 would implement a bipartisan plan that was passed by the Minnesota State Legislature and signed by the Democrat Governor Dayton to authorize a no-cost land exchange. It would allow Minnesota school trust lands locked away within the federal wilderness area to be exchanged for federal land from the multiple-use Superior National Forests. State forest lands would be fairly exchanged for federal forest lands. But typical of the attitude held by many Democrats that spending more of taxpayers' money will solve the problem, the critics of this bill have suggested that the federal government should simply buy these inaccessible trust lands at a potential cost of tens of millions of dollars. Now, this is at the same time when the federal government has had more than trillion-dollar budgets for the last 4 years under this president. However, the much-needed solution in this bill would consolidate state-held lands within the wilderness area and allow the state of Minnesota to access and develop new trust lands from the Superior National Forests. This will benefit state schools at no cost to the federal taxpayers, with the additional benefit of job creation and economic development. And let me elaborate on that, Mr. Chairman. It has been shown time and again that states are far more effective in managing lands for sustainable use and revenue generation than the federal government. For example, in my home state of Washington, they have been able to produce more than 1,000 times the revenue for education on 2.2 million acres of state trust land, as opposed to the U.S. forest land is able to generate on 4 times that amount, 9 million acres. In other words, We generate 1,000% revenue on 1/4 of the land because it's administered by the state. I think the same principle can apply to Minnesota. Putting these state lands back to productive use for education will increase funding for schools across the state, while at the same time creating new opportunities for job creation and economic growth. So this bill is more than a land exchange. It's about keeping a promise when Minnesota became a state. It's about correcting the 34-year consequences of federal action that restricted access to this vital asset. And it's about ensuring that children in schools have the funding that they deserve and were promised. So I urge support of this bill, and with that I'll reserve my time.
Gentleman reserves the balance of his time. Gentleman from Arizona.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I've give myself as much time as I may consume.
Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Federal land grants to states for education have resulted in the transfer of more than 77 million acres of land to over 30 states. These well-meaning acts, taken over 200 years ago, have left communities across the country with a fragmented pattern of land ownership. Through the Northwest Ordinance enacted in 1787, Minnesota was granted 8.3 million acres of school trust lands. Today, the state has only 2.5 million acres left, with 93,000 located in the Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness. Proponents of this legislation claim this bill will right inequities caused by the designation of the Boundary Waters Wilderness Area. For most of us, it would seem like common sense to do a land trade, but I think most of us would also want a land trade that is fair to both sides. The state of Minnesota recently enacted state legislation that would allow an exchange of state and federal lands. While controversial, it garnered bipartisan support and didn't include language suggesting that we need to waive federal laws. As my colleague, Congressman McCollum, will tell us, the state did their job. It is now time for Congress to do our job. Our job is to protect taxpayer assets and the democratic process. Congressman Korvac's bill fails on both of these accounts. We just need to look at the facts. By failing to require the standard public process that allows all Americans the ability to participate and comment on the exchange of assets, H.R. 5544 robs the citizens of this nation of their right to participate in the democratic process. Unlike every other land trade bill brought before this Congress, we have no map showing what federal lands will go into state ownership for development. Neither the people of Minnesota nor the people of the United States have any idea if we will lose lands critical to protecting drinking water or vital to hunting or motorized recreation. There is no map. The federal lands to be traded are not identified. 3 Native American tribes have tribal treaties guaranteeing tribal members the right to hunt, fish, and gather in the Superior National Forest. This bill potentially deprives these tribes of their access rights. Second, by failing to ensure that our assets are appropriately valued as part of the exchange, Congressman Korvac's bill shortchanges the American taxpayer. H.R. 5544 defers to the state of Minnesota to decide the value of federal lands. When Congress authorized the sale or exchange of federal assets, it is our job to make sure the federal government is getting a good deal. Again, for every land exchange this Congress has considered, we have relied on standard appraisal processes that are well understood by real estate professionals and land managers. Overriding this practice is like buying a house based on an appraisal provided by the owner, with the owner admitting they don't really have an updated assessment. Such a scheme fails to protect the interest of the American taxpayer who owns this land. We are not talking about a couple $1 million of taxpayer assets here. Estimates nearly a decade old place the value of these lands at nearly $100 million. Third, it is not clear this legislation is going to accomplish its stated goal, education investment. During committee consideration of this legislation, Minnesota school officials testified that of the $9,000 per year spent on an average Minnesota students, $26, less than 1%, comes from school trust land receipts. This entire bill is geared geared to making up to $650,000 the state believes it has lost, a mere drop in the bucket to the overall necessary education investment. An amendment offered by Congressman Hastings that is self-executed in the rule shortchanges 3 counties in Minnesota. Since 1948, Congress has and continues to provide St. Louis, Cook, and Lake counties mandatory annual payments to compensate them for lost revenues related to the designation of the Boundary Waters Wilderness Area. Since the passage of the Boundary Waters Wilderness Area Act, these counties have received nearly $60 million in compensation on payments alone. Last year, these payments amounted to $6 million. Chairman Hastings' amendment stops increases in these payments, which CBO estimates would be approximately $1 million. This is ironic considering the entire bill is justified on the state estimating the exchange will increase their school trust revenues by $650,000 a year. Wouldn't it make more sense to go back and see if we can make better use of existing money going to the state and to the county? Finally, this bill fails to garner broad bipartisan support. Not one Democrat from the Minnesota delegation has co-sponsored the legislation. Nearly 25 organizations in the state have written Congress in opposition to the legislation. Minnesota backcountry hunters and anglers, representing over 2 million hunters and anglers, oppose the bill. The Star Tribune's editorial board says the bill fails the credibility test and is about converting forest land to mining. Many of us, including myself, have had bills to accelerate the land exchange process. However, those bills have safeguards, like ensuring that the public can participate in the process, safeguards like ensuring Uncle Sam won't become Uncle Sucker, leaving taxpayers with a raw deal, safeguards like ensuring treaties and guaranteeing access to tribes that are not impacted. This bill has none of those safeguards. There are ways to do land exchanges that earn public support, garner bipartisan endorsements, and protect taxpayers. This bill fails on all counts and should be rejected. And, Mr. Chairman, I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves the balance of his time. Gentleman from Washington.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I'm very pleased to yield 8 minutes to the sponsor of this legislation, as somebody who has worked extremely hard on behalf of his constituents to correct the injustice that was imposed in 1978. 8 minutes to the gentleman from Minnesota.
The gentleman from Minnesota is recognized for 8 minutes.
I thank the Chairman for yielding. And thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today in support of H.R. 5544, the Minnesota Education, Investment, and Employment Act. This bill supports all schools in the state of Minnesota, creates good-paying jobs in northern Minnesota, and makes the Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness for the first time whole. First, a little bit of history. When Minnesota became a state in 1858, sections 16 and 36 of every township were set aside in trust for the benefit of schools. The state could use, lease, or sell the land to raise money for education. In the beginning, the state leaders decided to sell some of the more valuable parcels of school trust lands. But around the turn of the century, they realized they needed more sustainable plans and began putting a school trust lands to productive use, timber and mining in my district. As Democrat State Representative Denise Dietrich has so aptly educated me in, these lands are not so much owned by the state as held in trust by the state and owned by the school children of Minnesota. It is the responsibility of school trust fund trustees to maximize the return of these lands for the benefit of this fund for our children. This is written in the Minnesota Constitution. But in the 1970s, the federal government created the Boundary Water Canoe Areas Wilderness. The lands within the Boundary Waters cannot be logged, leased, sold, or mined in order to preserve the unique wilderness character of this pristine land. But as a result of its creation, Minnesota and students have been placed with an 86,000-acre problem for over 30 years. 86,000 acres of state-owned school trust lands have been landlocked within the borders of the Boundary Waters and have been able to produce critical funding for Minnesota public education. It is imperative that we resolve this long-standing problem. Our goal is to preserve and protect the boundary waters and allow state-owned school trust lands to raise revenue for Minnesota education. It's a win-win. Unfortunately, Minnesota school kids and their teachers have been cheated out of a public education funding now for over 34 years. Finally, after years of inaction, stalling, and dilatory tactics by special interest groups, Republicans and Democrats have come together in Minnesota and said enough is enough. On March 22nd of this year, an overwhelming majority of Democrats and Republicans in the state passed State Senate File 1750 by a vote of 53-11 passed the bill. On April 3rd, the House followed suit, passing their bipartisan bill by 90-41. On April 27th, our Democrat Governor Mark Dayton signed the bill into law. H.R. 5544 executes the bipartisan state plan. Allow me to say that again. The H.R. 5544 executes the bipartisan state plan. This bill would exchange state-owned school trust lands trapped in the boundary water canoe areas to the federal government in exchange for federal government-owned land outside the boundary waters. Additionally, this bill includes important provisions that would ensure Minnesotans can maintain their hunting and fishing rights within the boundary waters. To be clear, this bill does exempt only the land exchange portion from NEPA. The land exchange itself would have no environmental impact, and any future development would still be subject to strict state and federal regulations. Again, a land swap is merely a redrawing of maps and has no environmental impact in and of itself. I want to be very transparent here, though. One of my goals is to have this bill created to make sure that we have jobs in northern Minnesota. The lands listed in Senate File 1750 are rich in natural resources. Many of them lie within portions of the Superior National Forest that are already being successfully mined for iron ore and harvested for timber. It's a working forest and creates thousands of good-paying jobs in the region. Northern Minnesotans need these opportunities, and every American benefits from the steel and the lumber that goes into our cars to our homes. I generally support the aims of NEPA, but obstructionists and special interest groups have a track record of abusing the NEPA process. The state of Minnesota cannot afford to be sued by environmental groups for years into the future just for the sake of blocking this land exchange. I will not allow special interest groups acting in bad faith to abuse the NEPA process and use frivolous lawsuits to block and derail land exchange at the taxpayer's expense. School kids and teachers in Minnesota can't wait years, possibly decades, for this funding. In the school district where I live, North Branch, Minnesota, some classes have 40 kids in them, and the school has been reduced to a 4-day school week. You call this progress? This legislation will generate a lot of funding for our schools and create good-paying jobs. Importantly, the Minnesota Education Investment Employment Act would not eliminate a single acre of Boundary Waters land and cost nothing to the American taxpayer. In fact, it would add acreage within the existing wilderness area boundaries while giving Minnesota school children the land that rightfully belongs to them. I urge my colleagues to support this bill. I thank you for yielding. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I will yield back.
Gentleman from Arizona.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'd like to yield to the gentlelady from Minnesota, Ms. McCollum, as much time as she may consume.
Gentlelady from Minnesota is recognized for such time as she may consume.
The House should not be spending its limited floor time on this bill. The House should be debating the American Jobs Act, the President's plan to put nearly 2 million Americans back to work without adding a dime to the deficit. Instead, today, the Republican majority has a land exchange bill on the floor that is completely unnecessary. I want to stress that it is unnecessary. The state of Minnesota, the U.S. Forestry Service have all the authority they need to finalize this land exchange, and finalization is what they are working on. There's a stakeholder process underway in Minnesota to determine this proposed land sale and exchange, and it's underway. And they're going to do it, and they're working on it with everyone at the table. So why are we debating this bill at all? I was a state representative for many years. And I worked on a lot of land exchanges. And I've never worked on a land exchange that has been so unnecessary as what I'm being asked to vote on today. This is a reckless bill, and it also sets a terrible precedent. This legislation does not specify what lands are to be exchanged. Yes, we know about the school trust fund land, and that's specified. We know where that is, but we don't know what lands are to be exchanged. We don't know what the finished product is. Members of Congress are being asked to endorse a land exchange without knowing what lands will be exchanged. This legislation does refer to a bill in the Minnesota State Legislature, and the Minnesota legislation does not include a map of the federal lands to be exchanged. It does not include a map. This is the first time in the history of the Congress, to bring a bill, a land exchange to the floor without maps specifying what lands are to be exchanged. The first time in history. Every member of this House should be asking themselves one simple question: where are the maps? Now, as I said, I've done many land exchange bills in my service in the Minnesota legislature, and the first rule of all those land exchange bills is don't forget what you're exchanging out. We always had maps. We had the cost, we had the value, and the public input, and I believe the Minnesota state legislators should be able to finish that process themselves. Working with U.S. Forestry, working in a transparent fashion to know exactly what we're voting on. Why are maps important? Because without a map, it's impossible to determine how many Minnesotans could possibly see their property rights threatened by this bill. Can anyone here today tell me how many Minnesota cabin owners could open up their front doors and find a lack of public access to water that they have used and recreated in for years? There's no map. No one can answer that question. Can anyone tell me how millions of dollars Minnesota will lose in property value because of issues like this, because of H.R. 5545? No one can answer that question, because there are no maps. This bill could, and I believe will, greatly reduce public access to hunting, fishing, and snowmobiling in areas where the public currently has access. Minnesota Backcountry Hunters and Anglers is a sportsman conservation group. They represent over 2 million hunters in Minnesota and anglers as well. The group sent a letter to the U.S. members of the House this month opposing this bill, and I'd like to quote from it. Quote, "It provides no protective measures for how the land may be used, no assurances that existing activities like hunting and fishing and angling would continue." Why? Because there is no map. There are also 700 miles of snowmobile trails in Superior National Forest that could be at risk because of this bill. These trails are where public and private lands intermingle, and where public and private entities have worked for years raising money and revenues to be able to recreate. But no one can tell me, not Mr. Kravac, not Mr. Hastings, no one here, no one can tell me how many trails, lakes, and hunting areas could be closed by this bill, because there is no map. In addition, this bill eliminates the public's ability to participate in any decision-making process because it waives the National Environmental Policy Act process. That's just not the way we do things in Minnesota. We bring people together at the table. We make sure everyone is at the table. The state, the federal government, the local governments, the property owners, the hunters, the anglers, the tribal nations, the conservationists, the taxpayers, and yes, the job generators. We make sure that decisions are transparent, and the transparency means you have to include a map. We make sure to get fair market value for land that is sold and exchanged, so that it's in the best interest of the taxpayers. As a member of Congress representing Minnesota, and as a member of the House Interior Subcommittee, I am committed, I want to stress, I am committed to supporting land exchange so that it's a good deal for Minnesota, a good deal for the American taxpayers, and I'm committed that the process that's in place in Minnesota moves forward. I serve with those northern legislators. They have fought for years to get something on the table. They deserve to have the process finished and finished correctly. They need good legislation, not bad legislation. Minnesota will produce good legislation. There is a stakeholders group in Minnesota that is working to determine if the land proposal is fair and transparent. They're not at the table, folks. It does not require a congressional action to finalize their proposal. It does not take congressional action to move forward the legislation that has passed and been signed into law by the governor. This bill is unnecessary, it's reckless, and it sets a dangerous precedent for this House, for the first time ever, to vote on a land exchange without a full, complete map. The House should defeat H.R. 5544, and it should allow Minnesota to move forward without this interference and this recklessness. With that, I yield back.
Gentleman from Washington.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm pleased to yield 4 minutes to the chairman of the subcommittee that dealt with this legislation, gentleman from Utah, Mr. Bishop.
Gentleman from Utah is recognized for 4 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, we do processes here in government, and hopefully we do them for a reason. But when the process we have harms kids, we should ask ourselves, why do we have this slavish devotion to the process? The problem before the state of Minnesota today is simply federal action that took place 34 years ago that took lands guaranteed and devoted to the kids of Minnesota and took them away by federal action 34 years ago. I live in a state that does have a state trust lands policy, where the use of that school makes a significant contribution to the education of our kids. It wasn't always that way. We took it seriously. The state of Minnesota now wants to take this process seriously and develop resources that would be beneficial for their kids in a significant way, and equalize the process as we do in my home state to benefit all the kids that are in public education. This is one of those situations in which we have had plenty of time to solve this problem, but obviously the federal government has not moved forward to give to the state of Minnesota what will benefit their kids. In the hearing we had on this particular bill, Forest Service said, yeah, we can do this process. Give us about 4 years to evaluate all these lands. 4 years to evaluate these lands. Our Constitution gives us a right to a speedy trial. I wish it gave us a right to speedy decisions by bureaucrats. 4 years, an entire class of kids can start and finish high school without having any benefit from these lands that were theirs in the first place. I do not know why those who constantly breathe the air of the Potomac River are the ones who are always wringing their hands and dragging their feet, but it seems to be the same way. Mr. Chairman, you and I worked in the state legislature where we had time limits. I had 45 days to get something accomplished or you didn't do it. I taught school on trimesters. I had 90 days to cover the material, or I didn't get to do it. Can you imagine what would happen if the principal came to me and said, we're going to do our final test on Tuesday? And I said, I'm sorry, I couldn't possibly cover all that material by Tuesday. Maybe in 4 years from Tuesday, I might be able, if you're lucky, to get through the material and actually be ready for that particular test. One of the issues in this campaign is indeed dealing with permits. What takes my state 45 days on an average or less to permit takes the federal government 307 days on an average to do it. That's the process we're talking about here. The state of Minnesota has a state process in place. It covers tribal issues. It covers all the issues that are there, and this would take precedent. The state of Minnesota is just as smart as the Federal Forest Service in solving these problems, except the state of Minnesota wants to do it quickly, and the Federal Forest Service is not. This will also eliminate potential delaying litigation using federal laws to actually do that. It is simply time for us to realize that this bill passes. It helps the Forest Service because it takes away in-holding problems. It also helps kids of Minnesota because it guarantees a funding source for their education in the future. We should be doing our job and moving us forward and taking this process away from an agency that moves at glacial speed to help kids. It is time. It's time we do something to help kids instead of harming kids. This bill helps kids, and I am proud to vote for it. I yield back whatever time I have.
Gentleman from Arizona.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. part of the argument is that the Forest Service is dragging its feet and will not allow this process to continue. I would suggest that Minnesota, its legislature, came to the realization there was something they needed to do, and that process was initiated, legislation was passed, and that process continues. The role of the federal government in hindering that it does not exist. This was a volition and a decision that Minnesota and its representatives had to take. On June 22, 1948, President Truman signed legislation into law to authorize the acquisition of private lands within what is now known as the Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness. The legislation was promoted as a way to protect important natural resource values from commercialization and to compensate Cook, Lake, and St. Louis counties for the loss of property tax revenue. During the legislative process, Congressman Blacknick argued that counties should receive 12 cents per acre of federal land for compensation of lost property tax revenues. The Truman administration, arguing the 12 cents per acre figure was excessive, negotiated compensation to 0.75% of fair market value, which is the way the law was enacted and stands today. Each year since, these counties have received mandatory payments adjusted periodically to reflect increased property values. Last year, these payments totaled over $6 million. Under the funding formula, more federal lands mean more federal money. Absent the Hastings Amendment, Lake, Cook, and St. Louis counties, all within the sponsor of this legislation's district, stood to receive another $1 million annually. We raised the questions regarding this payment from the time the bill was heard in subcommittee until the bill was reported to full committee. In fact, I sent letters to each county commissioner in these counties trying to learn more about how these funds are used. I received 2 responses. Both indicated they support the current Blacknick formula and relied on these payments to compensate lost property tax revenue. If there's no objection, I would like to enter both these letters into the record.
Without objection.
Thank you. Surprisingly, no one wants to talk about these payments because they would be considered earmarks. Earmarks which